So today on the podcast, what I want to get into is 3 objections that I commonly hear people say against Christianity and against religion really as a whole that they seem to think disproves Christianity. But ultimately, these objections don't make any sense. There's no way that in any way this could be a proof against Christianity or really any religion at all. Yet, I hear these time and time again, and here are the 3 objections that we're going to deal with today. Hasn't science disproven God? 2, doesn't the existence of other religions mean that your religion is false? And lastly, we can't know beyond a shadow of a doubt that any religion is actually true. So with the first objection, hasn't science disproven God? This is probably among the 3, the one that I hear the most common in the sense that this is the one that's not as hidden. The other 2, it's easy to kind of see the ways which someone might say something and you might not be identifying that that's actually the objection that they're making in the long run. This one, it's plain as day. They're going to say something along the lines of, doesn't evolution disprove God? Hasn't science shown that miracles don't exist? Things along those lines to say ultimately science has disproven God. But can it? Really? No. Ultimately, there's no possible way that science could disprove God. Now, some of you might be objecting now and say science can prove anything. Science is the way we know anything. Is that really true? There's one comic strip that I always like to show people, and if you're watching the video, I'll put it up on the screen. And it's this picture, little comic strip, and it's Thomas Aquinas, and he's in a bar, because Thomas Aquinas, being a Catholic, good Catholic man, enjoys a beer every now and then. And someone comes up to him and he says, why does philosophy matter? And Thomas Aquinas' reply back to him is, why does science matter? And as the scientist begins to explain, well, the reason why science is important, Thomas Aquinas interrupts him and says, and now you're doing philosophy. Ultimately, what that points out is the fact that science itself is grounded in philosophy. We don't come to an understanding of what science is and what science does, or the ways that we should even do the scientific method or other things by doing science, by doing some lab experiment in which suddenly we end up with results out of beakers and measuring cups and everything else that results in the phrase, you should make a hypothesis, test it with an experiment, and then change your mind if your hypothesis was wrong. There's nothing in science that does a lab test to do such a thing. Instead, we rely upon philosophy to understand those things. So in that sense, there's a limit to what science knows. And in fact, when we look up definitions and understandings of what science is, we actually see that science is actually the study of nature. So when someone comes and says, hasn't science then disproven God? We have to ask, how would it do so? If science is the study of nature and God is supernatural, how is the study of nature going to disprove the existence of something that is beyond nature? It'd be kind of like saying, doesn't the rules of basketball prove that you can't shoot a goal in soccer? That question just doesn't make sense because the laws of basketball or the rules of basketball would have no application to the rules of soccer. And so how can science disprove God? Well, someone might object. Well, science has shown that we could have evolved into the creatures that we are now and we don't need an intelligent maker. Okay, one could make that argument, but that doesn't mean God doesn't exist. It just means that God doesn't have to exist. It doesn't automatically disprove him. It maybe fills in what we might say are parts of science that leaves a gap that allows for a possibility that a designer is needed or something like that. But it would in no way disprove God's existence. It would only say that we could be consistent in saying that God doesn't exist. Now, I ultimately don't even think that those arguments hold value. And ultimately, I would say evolution and other things don't really end up proving everything as well as they think they do. And ultimately, what we can see is that there's things that point to that we have a designer. We don't look at a watch and just assume that it's come out of random acts of lava and gravity acted upon each other and somehow making metal and gears, and those gears finding each other and eventually turning into a watch. We assume that it has a designer. And our bodies are much more complicated than that. Even the single-celled organism, which life is supposedly evolved from, has enough DNA information to be contained within 100 or 1,000 sets of Encyclopedia Britannica. That's a lot of information for the one organism that all of life started from to have from the beginning. I would say that's reason to think that we have to have someone who's designed us, something that is an intelligent maker. Now, again, that'd be a whole nother question to determine whether or not there's enough science to prove the existence of God. Now, we could look at something within science and see that there is no explanation. Ultimately, maybe there are limits to science that allow us to say we cannot figure this one thing out, and maybe the only reasonable explanation is that God exists. Oftentimes, J. Warner Wallace, a famous apologist, there's a link in the description to his book, and in his book, he explains that as a investigator of cold case crimes, he would actually look for all of the evidence, but when he realized something wasn't adding up within the scene, the crime scene, and there's evidence that speaks to maybe there must be a murderer that's outside of the room, or I need something else to explain some of the facts and the data that I've come across, then I'm not going to just assume that everything's here in the crime scene. There's something else that I need to understand. And so there's something else involved, someone else involved in the murder or whatever it is. And so in that sort of case, if you're just going to propose science has disproven God, in those elements where possibly there's something beyond what science can explain, what you've said is we can only look at the evidence that we have here in the room. We can't look beyond it. That doesn't really make sense. We have to be objective. We have to be willing to accept possibilities beyond what we know and what we see at the moment. That doesn't necessarily prove God either, but it does show that science can't disprove God in those cases. And ultimately, science will never have the ability to disprove God because, again, God is by definition supernatural. And if science then is specifically only talking about what is natural, there's no way that it could ever disprove the existence of God. Another objection that I've often come across is, doesn't the existence of other religions mean that your religion is false? Now, I never hear anybody say it like this, but the idea is there. A lot of times someone who I'm talking with might say, well, what if I'm a Buddhist? Are you saying that me and everyone who believes what I believe are wrong? Most people in the world don't believe in Christianity. Aren't you saying that they're wrong? As if to say, because I'm proposing that my religion is true, it's maybe unfair, and if it's unfair, then it can't be true. Somehow, when it comes to religion, we get into this mindset of it can't be objective, that all other truths we would look at and we would say, logically speaking, that either 2 + 2 = 4 or 2 + 2 = 5, but it can't equal both. We would say that Abraham Lincoln existed or he didn't. We can't both exist and not exist. But when we talk about God and religion, somehow it becomes relative. Somehow or another we look at it and say, well, maybe both of these religions can be true. And that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Going back to the objections of science that we talked about previously, we understand that science uses reason, uses logic. Those are things of philosophy that are actually what science is grounded in, but not science itself. So when we're talking about religion, we should also have those same set of rules that apply to religion. Either God exists or he doesn't. Either Christianity is true and Jesus is God as he claimed according to Christianity, or Jesus isn't God. And maybe he never claimed to be God in the first place, as the Muslims believe. But when Muslims say that and Christians say something different, we can't both be right. And just because people have different opinions on it doesn't mean that the objective or the truth value of that thing is relative. It'd be like saying, until you prove to me that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 65, 75, 85, 1,000,004, then you haven't proven to me that 2 plus 2 equals 4. A lot of times when we're discussing religion, I've even come across people that will make a similar claim to that, to say, well, how do you know that those religions are false? Well, it's really quite simple. Ultimately, I've come to see enough evidence to know that Christianity is true. And if Christianity is true, any religion and anything that says otherwise has to be false. If I do math, I gain an understanding that 2 plus 2 equals 4. I don't have to prove to you that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 5 anymore. Just knowing that 2 plus 2 equals 4, I've already eliminated that other possibility. The same thing goes for religion. I don't have to prove that every other religion is false, or that every other religion is false in everything it believes. This is also a misunderstanding. When I say that Christianity is true and all the other religions are false, I'm not saying that they're false about everything they say. I'm just saying that they're false in the things that they disagree with Christianity about. When Muslims claim that Jesus never died and rose from the dead, I have to say you're wrong about that. But when a Muslim says there is only one God, I agree with them. They are right. But just because I'm saying they're right about one thing doesn't mean I'm agreeing with them in everything. The typical analogy a lot of people like to throw out is this idea of blind men that fall into this pit. And when they fall in the pit, there's an elephant in the pit, and they've never seen, obviously as blind men, an elephant. They've never touched it. They have no idea what an elephant is. You haven't described it to them. You haven't told them what an elephant is. And as they're down there, they start touching the elephant, feeling it, trying to figure out what it is. And one blind man yells and says, "It's a snake," as he feels the tail. Another one might feel the legs of the elephant and decides, oh, it must be a pillar. Or another one feels the ear and says, it's like a leathery, alive piece of paper. Or someone feels the trunk and says, it's like a hose that sprays water. Now, in that analogy, a lot of people will say, see, all religions really speak the same thing. And you can't be right when you claim that Christianity is the only right religion. See, they're all just pointing to different truths about what religion is in actuality. But who in their right mind would see these blind men in the pit touching the elephant, saying the elephant's a snake and a pillar and a piece of paper, and say, you're right, that is what an elephant is? Of course not. That's not what an elephant is. An elephant is an animal in itself, and it has all of those parts together. Now, it's not simply that they're pointing out different truths. They're ultimately just wrong. That doesn't again mean that they're wrong to say that there are parts of the elephant that is like that. And that's what we mean when we say that Christianity isn't right about everything and everything else is wrong about everything. What we're saying is Christianity is right about everything. When we say it's an elephant is an animal. And when someone disagrees with that, they're wrong about that. But they might be right when they say an elephant has a tail that's a lot like a snake. We'd look at that and say, yeah, there's some similarities. You would be right in that in some sense or another. So that's another problem with the whole idea. Just because I'm saying that all the other religions are false, ultimately, doesn't mean that I'm saying that they're false about everything. They're just false when they disagree with Christianity. And that's how we would expect it. I don't have to disprove when I've proven one religion that all the other religions are false. It just simply follows. Just like when I've proven that 2 plus 2 equals 4, it's automatic to know that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 5 anymore. Finally, what about the people that say we can't know 100% that any religion is true? And I would agree with you. We can't know 100% that any religion is absolutely true, there's always going to be a little bit of a gap. A little bit of a gap in knowledge and understanding. We have to take a little bit of a leap of faith. Now, once I say that, of course, a lot of you are going to be jumping on that and saying, see, religion must be against reason. Because if you have to take a leap of faith, then obviously you don't have good reasons to believe in something. But that's not the same thing. Just because I'm saying I can't know 100% about something doesn't mean I don't have good reasons for it. I can't have 100% certainty whether Abraham Lincoln ever existed. I could start a conspiracy right now to explain that his top hat was just put there by the Smithsonian, that the carriage that they keep as well of the carriage that he was killed on his way to Ford Theater in was just a fabrication. That the history books all just wrote it down and were all part of the conspiracy. I could get all sorts of reasons that I can ultimately doubt whether Abraham Lincoln ever existed. But that doesn't mean it's reasonable. And although I would still have to take a leap of faith to say that I believe that Abraham Lincoln existed, the evidence points that direction. So when we're talking about religion, part of what we're doing is we're evaluating it just like we do anything else. We're not simply just saying that I'm just going to blindly believe in this, although there are Christians that do believe that blindly. There are plenty of Christians. There are plenty of believers in any religion that believe it blindly without any evidence whatsoever. But with Christianity, that's ultimately not the way biblically it's taught. Isaiah says, "Come, let us reason together." Thomas, when he doubts Jesus, whether or not he actually died and rose from the dead, says, "I need to see the holes in his hands and his feet and his side." Jesus didn't simply go up to Peter and tell Thomas to just have a little bit more faith. Instead, Jesus shows up with the exact evidence that Thomas is asking for. Paul, when he goes out and argues with people, he doesn't just simply give his testimony and hope that they believe in it. He actually argues, reasons, persuades. Those are the words that are used all throughout the book of Acts to reason people into the faith, to tell them why it is actually true. And so this idea that Christianity is ultimately just a giant leap of faith doesn't really make sense even biblically. Clearly, that's not the way Jesus looked at it. He wanted people to be able to see and examine the evidence, and Paul took that up in the way that he went about evangelizing the rest of the world. And so ultimately, when we're talking about Christianity and asking, we can't know 100% that any religion is true, I would agree. You're right. But we can also say that really about anything. People doubt whether the earth is flat or round. Of course, we know it's round. But you look at reasons. It's the same sort of thing when we do investigations on something. There's a point at which we look at it and we say, I could say that here's another objective or another answer to what we're talking about. This probably comes out, this argument, I've seen it more than anything when I'm talking about the resurrection. There's 5 facts that prove very well that most historians, 90% of them, agree are actually true. And I'm not just talking about scholars that are Christians. And with those, the best explanation of those facts, really the only one that explains all of those facts, is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Now, of course, people come up with all sorts of other theories to explain those facts. But just because you've come up with another theory doesn't mean it's the most reasonable explanation of the facts. Ultimately, we have to look where the evidence actually leads and points. And so when we talk about Christianity or religion as a whole, sure, we can't know with 100% certainty whether Christianity is true. But ultimately, we can look at the evidence and we see that there's a lot of historical evidence, both archaeologically and in written text, from both Christian and non-Christian sources, showing that Christianity is actually true and the claims that Christianity makes is actually true. So, can we know with 100% certainty? No, but we have good enough reasons to believe in it. It's not just blind faith. We're believing in it with reasons. And just because we can't know with 100% certainty doesn't mean my religion is false. You have to give now a reason that something else, or no religion at all, actually makes more sense. So just because I can't show you that it's 100% true, doesn't mean it isn't. Do you believe in free will? And did you enjoy this content? If so, please give it a like and a subscribe. Also think about supporting this ministry by clicking the link below. That allows me to create more content in the future and make this more of a resource for people down the road. If you're a Calvinist, then you were destined to do all of those things anyways.